It's battling origin stories. We want this to be our origin story. No, no, no. We
This is
want
why
this to be.
story is power. Story is an exercise in
Yes.
power and control. And the healthy leadership response, and the one that I advocate for, and this is the work that I do with organizations, is to say, how can we broaden the circle a little bit wider? Who are the voices that are not sitting in the circle telling their stories?
Yeah.
First of all, why aren't they here? And then how can we create opportunity for those different voices to come forward? When we talk about story, we're not talking about selling or elevator pitches. We're talking about, what does it mean to be alive? And we're talking about sense making. And it's connecting to the biggest questions of humanity. Why am I here? Why am I alive? What am I doing with this life? And what is this life wanting to do with me?
Welcome to the Leadership Disrupted podcast. And before we get to our guest today, I want to take a few minutes to tell you about how this podcast got started. Since the publication of my first book, Workplace Poker, I've had conversations almost weekly with people about their life at work, their careers, from people who are just starting out their careers to people on the other end, like in the last phase of their career. Mostly about their challenges, but people looking for advice, guidance, or just wanting some assurance that they aren't the crazy ones in their particular situation. With me acting as sort of a Dear Abby of the workplace, if you will. And as part of my day job, in addition to that, I have conversations every week with business leaders about the leadership development needs of their organizations. And while I've always noticed a bit of a disconnect between those leadership conversations and what they're focused on and the employee conversations and the challenges they're experienced, there's always been a bit of a gap or a disconnect. I started to notice a few years ago that gap was widening. And it was subtle at first, but as I began to notice it consciously and to look for it, I began to realize there are really two different conversations going on regarding the experience of employees, who many of them are leaders themselves in the workplace, and then the experience of leaders who are responsible for culture, responsible for vision, responsible for strategy. And that gap, I've been seeing it get wider and wider. And at first, I just found it a curiosity. Then it was a little dismaying, a little frustrating, and even, I would say, disillusioning. I felt kind of cynical. Wow, we're two different worlds, two different languages. But every now and then, I would have a great conversation with a leader who seemed very aligned with their employees, very aligned with what their employees' concerns were, very aligned with where the world is and is going, what's really happening in the workplace today. And I would come away from those conversations feeling like, man, I wish I could share that with more people. That would be really cool. And that's really where the concept of the Leadership Disrupted podcast started. Had conversations, recorded those conversations, posted them to a podcast without even knowing, would the podcast get traction. And it turned out there's a small but growing group of what I call affectionately leadership nerds who are really interested in where the world is going, not just standard leadership competencies, not just standard leadership capabilities or leadership models, but actually thinking through, what kind of leader do we need today? What kind of leaders will we need in 2030 and beyond? And the answers to those questions, at least so far, I don't think they reside in any one person. They reside in a lot of different people. And I have found that having these conversations, recording them and sharing them, has not only been great for the people who listen to the podcast, but for me as well. And it's become a huge part of helping me to evolve my thinking in the leadership development space. And so in that same spirit, we're bringing back to you today David Hutchens, who we had a previous conversation with regarding the art of leadership storytelling. And I came away and I was telling David this just before this podcast. Um, I was telling him how much I learned from that conversation, how much I applied those learnings to my real world. And we're going to get into that. And so I want to introduce to you David Hutchens. If you have not viewed the previous podcast, I would recommend you go back and watch that one as well. We're not going to cover the same ground. We're going to take that as a basis and we're going to move forward. But I really do feel like there's a rich mine of information and insight that we can all benefit from. So with that said, first of all, David, welcome back. Great to have you here. And if there's anything of note, like since the previous conversation that you wanted to share, or anything else, just as an introduction of who you are, that would be a great place to start.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dan. That opening is really lovely, and it just makes me appreciate anew again working with you and what you're doing with this podcast and the conversations about leadership you're bringing forward. And I resonate with everything you said, because my work is bringing this age-old technology that is storytelling into the modern workplace so that we can do something with that. And it's exactly what you just said, because a lot of the leaders that I work with, they call me because they want influence. They say, ooh, if I tell a story, I can get people to do something. And I say, yeah, you can. We'll talk about that, but you'll get so much more, because it's really about bringing more humanity and more of ourselves and purpose and intent to our leadership. And so that's what we explore in this work that is storytelling. Since the last time I talked to you, the fastest growing part of my business right now is taking this core offering I have called the Storytelling Leader. It's a skill building experience. And the big change today is licensing. I'm working with organizations to scale this skill, not just doing learning experiences with 30 leaders at a time, but scaling it across the system. So now it's thousands of leaders at a time, exercising this different kind of voice and looking at what happens when we build this skill in big systems and what might be possible in terms of culture and identity and transformation and how we connect personally to the work. So it's a rich conversation. I think you and I will have lots to talk about today.
I tell you, so I know that what originally got my attention was something you've written on LinkedIn, grabbed my attention. I thought this would be a cool person to talk to, and that was absolutely true. Great conversation, and then it happened again where you had a couple of recent posts about origin stories, and in one case it was an organization that had, I guess, what I would call not necessarily a false origin story, or maybe you would characterize it as false. It was not accurate. It was not complete. Let's say that it was not a complete origin story. It was a well scrubbed origin story, and that happens in our world. The Kennedys have a well scrubbed origin story. I mean, if there's an origin story for the Kennedy family that goes way back. That's not necessarily the story they want everyone to hear. So it's not unusual for large companies to do a bit of scrubbing regarding their origin story. But I'm wondering, is there anything you'd like to share about that particular example? And I'd love to hear about how you resolved that with them. Did they acknowledge that?
Yeah.
Ultimately, what happened?
So origin stories, when we talk about the story space, origin stories are really powerful. It's a rich conversation. We can go deep just on this subset of organizational narrative that is origin stories. And that's where you just started. You were revisiting the origin story of this podcast, right?
Absolutely. And I will say that speaks to, we said this before, stories are not just, hey, me telling this for you, but while I'm telling this for you, it's also working in the other direction as well. I end up feeling different about my origin by
Yeah.
sharing that story. So it's a dual purpose as I reframe or frame up, why am I doing this? What drove me here?
Right,
And
right.
I think a lot of us don't take the time to think through, why do I do what I do? Why do I really do what I
I would
do?
say, as you were telling the story about the podcast, in a very real way, you were authoring yourself.
Yeah,
You're creating in the moment. What does it mean to be Dan Rust? David Cooper, the theorist behind appreciative inquiry, talks about the principle of simultaneity. And by that, he means, everyone has this idea of, oh, if I tell a story, something will happen later. People will buy or they'll join the change movement or whatever. And that's true. The principle of simultaneity is to awaken us to the fact that when we're telling stories, change is already happening in the moment. We're
yeah,
leading in the moment. Something is happening in the room when we use this language. And so the example that you asked about. So this was an organization. Speaking of origin stories, this was an organization I worked with. This was a few years ago, and I'm not going to name the organization, but they are a maritime logistics organization. They do shipping overseas. And this organization loves telling their origin story. And the way they tell it, it kind of goes like this: that more than 100 years ago, their founder had a single rowboat, and he used that rowboat to carry supplies from the shore out to sailors who were on station in the Navy out in the Bay Area. And the way they tell the story, it's a rags to riches archetype that, starting 100 years ago with a single rowboat and a package of supplies, over the years, we have grown to be $1 billion player within the logistics industry. And when you go to the headquarters, there's even a sculpture there in the lobby of the rowboat. It's a bronze sculpture. And so, they're really owning this story and they're leading with the story, which is a wonderful thing to do. So anyway, I was working with this group and I was helping the leaders tell stories, and we were on break because the rowboat story had come up, and one guy kind of took me to the side and he whispered to me. He said, "So the deal with the rowboat story?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he said, "The guy was bringing prostitutes to the sailors." I was like, "Okay, that part's not in the sculpture."
yeah. Didn't make the cut.
It didn't make the cut. And so that's really interesting. So that's what you're talking about. There's you described it as a scrubbing. I might use a different word. Maybe it's a mythologizing. Because when I think of myth, there are these mythic stories. And
Yeah,
they're stories that take on truth in a different kind of way. Because none of us was alive 100 years ago. We weren't there. And so the story changes over the years. And at some level, we embrace that. We accept that this mythic story is saying something that's representationally true, kind of like the tortoise and the hare, right? What we take from that story is slow and steady wins the race, from that old fable. We don't believe that a tortoise and a hare really raced each other and that the turtle won. We draw this representational insight out of the story. That's what we do with mythic stories. And so, people ask me, well, what did you do, David, when you found out that the founding story was a lie? And I said, well, I think there's a difference between a lie and a myth. And
yeah.
the way you respond to those two things is a little bit different. And so to me, this is a mythic story that has evolved over the years. And there's always something deeper going on when we start unpacking those old stories.
And I think that I I can see why a person or a group of people might have decided to sanitize the story, and maybe this just says more about me than about the situation. Um, I I don't necessarily get the need to sanitize. I think there's probably a way, or could have been a way, to tell the full story. I mean, if you go back 100 years, the act of someone taking to sailors on ships the supplies that they need, and also prostitutes, it's really not a shocker. It's just it
Right.
is. In fact, the opposite might be
You kind
shocking.
of go, yep, sounds about right. Yeah.
Yes. So might there be a way to incorporate that truth into the story without, without going too far? Like with the bronze statue, you wouldn't necessarily expect the bronze statue in the lobby to include 5 women in the back of the boat. I mean, you wouldn't have to go that far, but at the same time, there could potentially be, reference to the things that sailors would pay for, the things that
Right.
sailors would need. But and not to overthink it too much, but I do think that one employee who came to you to say, "Hey, let me tell you the real story." I do think about that employee, because that person thinks he has a secret. That person thinks, see, they're not telling the truth, the real truth. And I do think
Yeah.
organizations and leaders have to be thoughtful about the lies that they tell. There are no little lies. Every lie has a price.
Yeah.
And sometimes the price is modest, sometimes the price is big. But I would never say to a leader, don't ever lie, because sometimes leaders have to lie by omission. Sometimes they have to lie by mythology. Sometimes sometimes they just have to overtly lie for specific reasons. But what I've seen with great leaders is that they acknowledge there are no little lies. So when they do have to tell an untruth or share an untruth, it's generally the result of thinking carefully through a situation and deciding, okay, I can't share this information, or for the sake of my employees, or the sake of my customers, or the sake of my whatever, this is what I'm going to say, and this is what I'm not going to say.
Yeah.
So it does happen. Um, what I see with great leaders is it's never about them. They never lie so that I don't have to face an uncomfortable truth, or an uncomfortable reality, or an uncomfortable situation. And mostly, for the most part, great leaders tell the truth. I mean, for the most part, they have a dedication to the truth, and they understand the power of having a reputation as a clear communicator, a truthful communicator. And I think in the world, I don't want to take us off track, and I feel myself starting to do that. But I think in today's world, truth is so rare, is so hard to grasp onto. If you can be one of those leaders and organizations with a reputation for truth, even hard truth, we yearn for that.
Right.
And but it is interesting. I mean, that whole story, that whole origin story is interesting, because even the sanitized version, it gives people energy. It gives people a framework to understand, this is who we are. This is why we do what we do. This is why we are proud of this, of being a part of this mission for this particular organization. Um, so so that is fascinating.
There's a lot to unpack. It is fascinating. And to be clear, I am aligned with what you were saying. So I live in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm on the board of a wonderful organization called Thistle Farms that's gotten global recognition for its for how it helps women come out of the world of sex trafficking and addiction. So I am very sensitive to the abuses of sex trafficking, and to the systemic impact of that, and how it hurts not just the women who are trafficked, but everybody who participates in that system
Mhm.
at some level. And so this organization is carrying some pain in its DNA. And I don't dismiss that lightly. And on LinkedIn, after I told this story on LinkedIn, a couple of people were like, "Oh, Dave, so how did you respond? Did you call them out? Did you confront them?" And I said, "No, it's first of all, my job is not to confront, it's to say,
Right.
What function is that story serving for you? Let's look at that story. And the other reason I didn't call it out in a confrontative way is because the story sense making process that always emerges was was doing its function that day. It was the whispering guy. It was
Yeah.
the guy who came up to me and said, "Let me tell you what really happened." And every organizational system has this shadow system where we have the espoused myth that we're bringing forward, the tortoise and the hare story. This says something archetypal, representational that we think matters. And then there's always voices in the system that hold the story and say, "Let me tell you what really happened." And that's where the truth is. That's where
And the
it's an
closer we can bring those together, but there's almost every time we present to clients, almost every time we tell our story to consumers, there's always a bit of scrubbing. I mean, no one says, uh, uh, "Hey, our food product has 3% fewer rat feces than our competitors." No, no one's going to say that. I mean, that's the truth. We are slightly less laden with rat feces than our competitors. No, but so, I think you have to be thoughtful about, you getting too, you'll get hoist, what's the phrase? Hoist on your own petard. If you say absolutely 100%, tell the truth. I mean, now I say that I'm an advocate for truth, and I feel that broadly speaking, our world has drifted so far away from even knowing what truth is. Misinformation,
right.
disinformation, to the point where there was a point when you and I were probably growing up when if a world leader was caught in a lie, it would be a big deal. It was, oh, this person said this thing, and we found out that it wasn't the truth. The It's probably not true, but the George Washington story, George Washington was a kid who chopped down the cherry tree, and he was for when he was asked about it, he said, "I cannot tell a lie." Now, I
Right.
don't know that that's a true story,
It's mythic.
but it
It's
represented a set of values, like we value not being able to tell a lie, and we've drifted so far away from that as the myth that we want to tell everybody, that I think when you make a commitment to being truthful, um, you find out that it is something that people yearn for. Um,
Mhm.
didn't want to I don't want to take us off track, but you'd also
No,
mentioned that there was a go ahead.
this is the conversation, and you asked an interesting question, which is this organization that I just told you about. What have they done with that story? And I'll tell you, this was a few years ago, so I've kind of lost sight of that. What I don't know is have they done any kind of atonement or reconciliation or acknowledgement that there's this
Mhm.
hurt that's built into our origin identity from 100 years ago. Did we do something with that, or did we bury that? Do we push that aside? And I don't have an answer on that for this organization. That
In a not necessarily in a perfect world, but I can envision a world where the organization decides, hey, this is an open secret. If one employee comes up to you and whispers it, in your ear, this isn't this is sort of most likely an open secret. And so then to what degree, how do we treat that open secret? How do we acknowledge and say to all of our employees, hey, here is the full nuance of our background story. Here's what we're doing about it. We don't want you to think that we're just ignoring it. We're acknowledging that this is our story, and here's how we've evolved since then, or something to that degree. Because I don't think it is healthy for like that employee, if he feels like the origin story is built on a foundation of lies, that's not good for him. That is going to impact
or any
his connection with the organization. And so, um, and I think that employees find it difficult enough today to bind themselves to their employer, because I at least once a week, I hear from an employee who is shocked that their employer has laid them off, or shocked that they've laid off other people. Just earlier this week, I had someone saying, "Hey, I work for an organization and we're all about family. We call each other family. We are a part of a family. It's family, family, family. But we just laid off 8,000 people." And
Families don't do. Yeah.
it just, and this employee said, "And I can't let it go." Now I'm happy that I was not laid off, but I can't let it go, because you don't lay off family. You find a way. He said, I would have accepted some like reduction in my salary or something. He said, I don't know that we tried hard enough to keep those people. And he said, I know some of those people, and it's affected him to the core, because his organizations, maybe it's not an origin story, but part of the story they tell themselves is we're family. And then they end up taking action that clearly goes against the grain of that story. And I think leaders at senior levels maybe never have to confront the reality at the mid-level of what they're doing and how it's impacting the stories that employees are now telling themselves about that organization. Now it's more of, we used to be a family business. We used to be all about family. And now we're about private equity. And private equity is just squeezing wherever they can squeeze. They're selling off some of our historic properties. They're selling off our heritage, essentially. And they're getting rid of people that have been around for decades, because they're finding that's where they can squeeze. So that's the new internal story that's being told. But I don't know that'll ever bubble its way up to senior leadership to understand that.
No, you're asking the exact right question, which is, what is the leadership response to this story that wants to emerge from the shadow system? And history is full of examples of power systems who responded by saying, we want to squash that story or remove that story so that it's not heard. And the results of that are often bloody. And then what happens is the story survives anyway. Story survives. The shadow system doesn't go away. I would say that there are some contemporary analogs to that happening right now in the USA, of wanting to erase some of our origin stories. It didn't happen the way that you're saying it happened, right? It's
battling origin stories. We want this to be our origin story. No.
This is why story is power. Story is an exercise in power and control. And the healthy leadership response, and the one that I advocate for, and this is the work that I do with organizations, is to say, how can we broaden the circle a little bit wider? Who are the voices that are not sitting in the circle telling their stories?
Yeah.
First of all, why aren't they here? And then how can we create opportunity for those different voices to come forward? There's a popular TED Talk from a few years ago. I think it was a TED Talk. The title grabbed everybody's attention. The danger of a single story. Right? You can hear the danger of a single story. That is disease in a system. Systems are made up of lots of stories, and health happens when we invite all of the voices into the conversation. And when you do that, you're going to hear some stuff you don't like. You're going to hear some people who don't stick to the talking points.
And it's going to take time to begin to integrate those talking points, if you decide that's the path that you want to go down. And I think part of what's happened, at least in the US, is that people have attempted to change our origin story more rapidly than others have been able to internally integrate it. So, in fact, we're recording this at a time where Thanksgiving is coming up. In my family, there is a current debate regarding the Thanksgiving table decorations, because there's an Indian maiden decoration, and she's like a candle holder, and then she has an Indian chief. They're like these two candle holders, And this particular item is it's like a heritage item. It's been in my family for as long as I can remember. But quite recently, some of the younger folks in the family have taken offense because it does look a little like 1950s ish, like and they just said, no, this is not the story that we tell ourselves, and this is distasteful to us. So the family has had to go through conversation after conversation about two candle holders
Wow.
because we're telling each other two different stories. Uh, for one group, this is just the story of our family. We've always had this. This is it's just pretty. And then for another group, it means something very different. But
Mm,
I wanted to
mm.
acknowledge something, and I'm afraid if I don't mention it right now, I will forget to acknowledge this. Um, when you and I came to our first conversation, I had a certain almost mechanical model in my head about storytelling because I've been through storytelling workshops. I've been through I've read books on storytelling. There was a point in my life where I was a wannabe screenwriter, so I read a lot about story and the beats of a film. So I felt like I understood story from the standpoint of decide what you want to tell and tell a good story that grabs attention, that keeps people engaged, and then either sells your product or sells your company or sells you as a salesperson. And that mechanistic view of storytelling, it wasn't wrong, but it was limited. And it took me about halfway through our first conversation for me to start to realize, okay, that I was just I was doing storytelling on training wheels, just doing very basic storytelling. And when I not just had that conversation with you, but then I ordered your leadership storytelling deck, and I began reading through some of your materials. I developed a much deeper sense of the power of storytelling. And then, like with the opening, when it comes to telling people the story of the podcast, I put so much more thought into that story because of the work that you've done, but also in my day job where I'm selling leadership development services to clients. I've taken every one of those aspects of the quote story that we tell and put a lot more thought into all of those. And so yes, it's much better at achieving the mechanistic goal of selling more.
Right.
Definitely better at that. But what really sits with me is how much of, I don't know what the right word is, how much of the story comes back in my direction. Like yes, it's better for the receiver, but it's also better for the teller. I feel like I am enriched by these stories in a way that I was never enriched when I was just hitting the beats of features and benefits. Let's make sure you tell the story of the product, so you hit the features and benefits. That's great, but there's just so much more.
There's so much more, and it's why I've been able to do this work for more than 2 decades and not get bored with it. I've brought in other topics into my leadership development work, and I'll stick with it for a few years, and I'll say, okay, it's time to move on to something else.
Yeah,
Not story. I've stayed with this for more than 25 years, and it's because you're right. When we talk about story, we're not talking about selling or elevator pitches. We're talking about what does it mean to be alive? And we're talking about sense making. And it's connecting to the biggest questions of humanity. Why am I here? Why am I alive? What am I doing with this life? And what is this life wanting to do with me? What is God? I mean, there's a
I,
reason why every religion is based in story, right? We're
mhm.
we're trying to figure all of this out, and story is the age-old technology that allows us to do something with that. And so I always think it's funny when leaders call and say, "Hey, we have a new app that we're introducing. We need to tell some stories about that." I'll say, "Yeah, we can do that. It'll be
Or
it'll be
yeah,
rich, it'll be fun." and you're going to get a lot more, and be ready for this. And let me show you what this is going to look like, because you're inviting. I mean, this is the language of transformation. How are we becoming in the world? And so when you open the door to storytelling for sales or for influence, a lot more is going to be coming into the room with that.
And I can say that now as an actual consumer of your intellectual property, of your insights. And I think it's probably okay to start with what I would call the mechanistic goal.
Yeah.
Hey, I want to persuade people to vote for me. I want to persuade people to buy my service or buy my product. I want to persuade them to hire me. I want to tell my story in a way where they hire me. You can have that as your very tangible or tactical goal, and you can end up being so much better at delivering on that goal, and at the same time get all of the other benefits as well. As now that I tell others my story of this, I'm also telling it to myself. I work with a group of people who have been impacted by the judicial system. They've been incarcerated, and one of the benefits of helping people think through the story that they tell themselves about their incarceration experience. If they tell themselves the story of, I'm a loser, I'm a liar, I'm someone who couldn't be trusted, I made mistakes. They can tell themselves a story about that horrible experience in their life that just ends up being a downward spiral, that just reinforces all the worst aspects of the experience that they've had. Or they can think through this and tell themselves a very different story. And this is the story they potentially can tell employers, they can tell others, they can tell people they might potentially get into relationships with, they can tell their friends and family. And I wouldn't advocate that they tell a story that's a lie, and it's not all sweetness and sunshine. You don't have to ignore the brutal reality of what they've experienced, but you can tell the truth in a way that energizes you and others to move your life forward. And I've not actually delivered any storytelling training, but in going through your material, I've recognized some of them will tell their story in the way that I just described, and you can see how it energizes them to move forward. It's you probably have a name for this. It's a not a coming of age story. It's an overcoming story.
Maybe a redemptive.
Yeah. It's a redemptive story
where we're changing the value of what happened from something negative into something positive. That's a redemptive.
Exactly. And so I've seen in real terms the deep power of that kind of redemptive story when you first internalize it so that you tell yourself that story, and then you tell it to others who might want to hire you or might want to consider being your friend or being in a relationship with you. You had mentioned that there was a client that you have where nobody knew their origin story, where the client actually had a pretty compelling origin story, but through the years, it had just gotten lost in the ether. So people are just doing their business and not recognizing the heritage that they're built upon. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, so this one is recent. The other one was a few years ago, but this one's recent. And so we're just talking about mythic stories and what if it doesn't fully represent what happened. Well, this is a different angle on the origin story. What if people have forgotten the origin story? Because I was working with this team of senior leaders, and we were telling stories in the room, which is what we do. And one of the team members told one of the company's origin stories, and it was good. It was a really cool story.
Mm-hmm.
And after she told the story, I heard a couple of people go, "Wow!" And I said, "What do you mean, wow? Did you not know that story?" And the person said, "Yeah, I haven't heard that." And the other person said, "I haven't heard that either." And I said, "All right, hold on a second. Show of hands, who here did not know that story?" And other than the lady who told the story, all these senior leaders raised their hand and said, yeah, I've never heard that. And then we started talking about it. It turns out they knew none of the origin stories of this organization. And I remember feeling kind of bad about this because maybe I came on a little too strong. And I said, if a person was walking around in the world and didn't know where they came from, that would be a really dangerous situation. I mean, we would treat that as a medical emergency.
Yeah.
It's called amnesia. This team had corporate amnesia, and they all seemed kind of sad. They seemed a little embarrassed. They're like, "Oh, we're sorry. Yeah, you're right. That's a good point." I'm like, "No, don't be sorry. I'm just saying it's." We have these stories and they make us who we are, and they are affecting our behaviors today, whether we know it or not. In fact, I have suspect if we don't know what the origin story is, I kind of have this belief that it's affecting us more. We're behaving in certain ways and we don't know why we're doing it. We're driven by stories from the past that we don't know are driving us. There's even a biological basis for this. If you've looked at the science of epigenetics, the idea that a trauma that your great grandfather may have experienced can switch genes on in the body that get passed down. Mm-hmm. So it's possible that you're holding and experiencing the trauma of your great grandfather today, and it's showing up in your body and you don't know where it comes from. So stories from the past define who we are today. And what I said to this group was, and the good news is that it's a big organization. They actually have a corporate museum. And I said, have any of you ever been to the corporate museum? They were like, no, we've never been. And I said, okay, here's your assignment.
Yeah.
Make a field trip. Go to the corporate museum. Start there. I don't know how truthful the stories are. It's a place to start. And learn the stories and then talk about them. What are these stories saying about who we are today? What are the parts of the stories that have lost? What are the stories from the shadow system? What's the part that wasn't true if you have that? Mm-hmm. Right? And now we're understanding who we are and what it means to be us and why we do things the way that we do. If you don't do that, we're a team of corporate amnesiacs making a mess in the world. So,
and I think that you are so right in terms of the overall dynamic in our society and our world, and it's not just in the U.S. It's global, because we've done surveys for the last 25, 30 years regarding employee engagement, and we're finding that employees are actually more and more disconnected from their workplace year after year after year. They're becoming more cynical, more disconnected, harder to motivate, harder to retain. And part of what I think is driving that is employees are not feeling connected to the work that they're doing, the workplace that they're working for, the organization that they're working for. And we're wondering why. And I think to some degree, or maybe a large degree, it's because they've been interviewed, they've been hired, they've got their OKRs or KPIs, they've got their job, but they wonder why does it all feel so light? Why does it all feel so empty? It all feels like the career equivalent of white sugar. Like we're just, but there's no depth to it. It's not, there's no sense of I'm doing this for a bigger purpose. I'm doing this for, or I'm part of a bigger tribe, or I'm part of a bigger organization, or even if it's a small company, I'm part of something that's more than just a paycheck that puts food on the table and pays my rent. That I'm part of something that's more. We yearn for that. But I think that's fading away for a lot of employees.
Yeah. I have a colleague who is a consultant to a Hollywood script consultant. She consults with Pixar and Universal Studios, and she calls story or cinema the art form of transformation. And she says the reason we go to the cinema, the reason we keep going back to movies over and over again, is we're all looking for the answers to three questions, and we want our movies to answer them. Will I find hope? Will I find meaning? Will I find transcendence? Hope. Will things get better than this? Meaning, can I connect with something outside of me that's bigger than who I am? Transcendence. Can I feel something bigger and more special than this mundane, boring existence that I'm in? And I tell leaders that a task of leadership is to answer those same questions. And I've found that's controversial for some. And a lot of the time we're improving processes, or we're implementing a marketing plan, or we're trying to keep a project on schedule. That's what most of our days are. But at the highest level, as leaders, the more we can connect to those questions, the more powerful and resilient and creative and generative and mission focused our team will become.
I want to pause and kind of stick with that for a moment, because you're so right, and it is becoming an increasing challenge globally with this disconnect from the workplace. But for you to say a key job for a leader is to help his employees, whether you've got just 3 direct reports or you've got 300,000 indirect reports, to say to a leader, part of your job is to help your employees view this work as part of giving them hope for the future, meaning for their lives, transcendence over the mundane. That even if, but I've seen it happen. I've seen it. It's not common, but I've seen a fast food owner, an owner of Taco John's restaurants, where the job itself is as menial as you could ask. The job is slapping refried beans and cheese and whatever into burritos, but that particular owner helps bring a sense of meaning to that job because of their involvement in their community, their contributions to the community, their engagement with their employees, helping to build the life and career plans of their employees. But that's very intentional. That particular Taco John's owner was never trained in the Taco John system in terms of, hey, here's how you bring meaning to the life of your employees. He was trained, here's how you use our system to create the least expensive, Mexican food most of them, can get exposure to. So the training of the franchise owner is very tactical, but he brought to his franchise the sensitivity that I want to retain these people for as long as possible. I want them to feel like this is more than just a part-time job or a low-paying minimum wage job, but this is something where they can get a sense of meaning and transcendence, because this job is a part of their life, whether they are going to be here for the next 3 months, 3 years, or longer. We can help them be more on their way out than they were when they were coming in. But that was very intentional on his part.
So
go ahead.
Yeah, none of your leaders who are listening to this are allowed to say, yeah, but you have to understand, I'm in the business of tacos. Or, I'll name one of my clients. I'm working with WD-40 company. Their product is an industrial lubricant. Doesn't sound too inspiring. They have done some innovative things with culture. They're doing some beautiful work with culture. So we talked about Southwest Airlines in the last podcast. It's low cost air travel. They talk openly about love as a leadership capability, right? So you're not allowed, wherever you sit, you're not allowed to say, oh, I'm just in IT or I sell tacos. We're all in the business of creating this human experience as we do the work together. And story is the language that allows you to have this richer conversation about hope and meaning and transcendence and who are we and what does it mean to be us and what does change and transformation look like. Story is the language that gets you there really quickly, really intuitively. Story already lives in your brain. You're born with it. When you had dinner with your family or friends last night, you told stories. No one has to tell you to do this. So we're taking this capability that already exists and using it to unlock this much better conversation about who we are, why we're here and what we're doing and why we're doing it.
So while you're talking, I've been secretly Googling to make sure I understood the term epigenetic memory. So I think I understand now. And I wonder if you go back millennia, we as humans or humanoids or whatever we were, spent a lot of time around fires telling stories. And I wonder if storytelling is just genetically embedded in us so that because we know when a great storyteller tells us a story, we know what it feels like to get pulled in. And you can as you open your mind to storytelling, I think you start to see more and more opportunities when you're recruiting, telling the story of your organization, telling the story of the team that they're going to be on, telling the story of the people that they're going to be working with. Storytelling can be embedded all around us in every aspect of what we're saying. And if we don't, we lose it. If we're not telling the new generation the story of our family, that story is going to be lost. If we're not telling new employees the story of our organization, that story is going to be lost. And I think at a bigger level, I think we are losing the story of us in our world today. There is so much discord. There's so much dissonance. There are battling or dueling stories of who we are. And it is impacting the culture within the workplace. I had someone I was talking to a few weeks ago, and the way he explained it, he said, I find that I cannot ignore the culture outside of the culture at work. There's this culture in the workplace, and I'm trying to drive a positive culture, but the culture outside of that culture is really having an impact on us because our new employees are coming in more cynical, more doubtful, more uncertain. And he said, I don't know what to do about that. I don't know that I can do anything about that. But he said, I know that our culture outside of the culture is broken in many ways. And I'm just battling it by trying to create a safe haven within this organizational culture for my employees.
I feel that. Mm.
You recently, at least when I was following you on LinkedIn, you recently spent some time with one of your clients in Norway. And that was particularly compelling for me because I have a Norwegian background. I've never been to Norway, but my heritage is all Norwegian. My mother is 100% Norwegian. My father is, I think, 50% Norwegian. So Norwegian heritage is in our blood. It's in our history. It's in the food we eat. It's in the way the things that we celebrate. And I've always wanted to go to Norway. Even when I did my ancestry DNA analysis, Ancestry is able to pinpoint for you like where your DNA originated in the 1700s, 1600s, 1500s, like where your ancestors were. And I started to tell myself the story of me, like the story of that DNA, the story of those settlers in those parts of Norway who seem to, if you follow the DNA track for my particular heritage, it seems to be the those who left Norway to go to England, probably invade England. So my DNA story seems to track with the story of the Viking hordes that invaded England. But it does something when it becomes part of your internal story. And I wonder, epigenetically,
it does something.
Are my genes, my wandering gene, my wandering, I'm not a conqueror. I'm not out, hoarding and conquering, but I have been a wanderer forever. And makes me wonder, is that part of my genetic story? Who knows?
Wow. Don't rush to the answers on that. Just
no.
And let it be with you. Let it emerge. So here's my version of that. I don't think I've shared this with you, Dan, because I've got a story like that as well. I was actually adopted into my family, raised in New Orleans by my family. And then 2 years ago at Christmas, my wife stuck in the Christmas stocking one of those 23andMe things where I spit in the tube and mailed it in, mainly because I wasn't trying to get family information. I was looking for medical information. Am I going to have a heart attack at 60? My wife would kind of like to know that, right? And so I mailed it in. 2 weeks later, I got an email. Hey, David, I'm your cousin, and I know where your sisters are.
Wow.
And so I've met my two half sisters. They're beautiful, and it was weird. It's like we loved each other instantly, and we all have this feeling of we have 50 years of catching up to do. It turns they're a Jewish family, so now I know I'm 50% Jewish. Did not know that, and so I'm in the same place with you of now I have an origin story. Being adopted in this world, I've talked to other adopted people. You walk around without this sense of an origin story. It's kind of weird.
Yeah.
And now I've got an origin story. What does it mean to be in this family? What does it mean to be Jewish? How do I connect that? How is that showing up in who I am today? So I'm on this same journey that you're on right now, Dan, of there's stories in me that are waking up right now and they want to do something. And I'm a willing listener.
And so, David, I want to be respectful of your time. This happened last time too. It's like we start to get to some really deep, interesting topics, and then
Time's up. Yeah.
time's up.
From our advertisers. Yeah.
Almost like a therapy session. Like you're just getting into it, and it's like, oh, well, time's up. Got to move on. But I guess the thought I would like to leave people with is that there is so much depth to our human story, and most workplaces are so shallow when it comes to acknowledging our human stories. And there's a cost to that. The reason I know there's a cost to it is because I'm talking to people every week about their dissatisfaction with the workplace, their challenges with the workplace, their sense that I can't quit this because I need to put food on the table, but I just get nothing. I get nothing except a paycheck. And if your people are getting nothing except a paycheck or a few perks, it's just a shame, because the workplace can, if someone can bring meaning and transcendence to Taco John's burritos, then you can bring meaning, or to WD-40. I mean, then you can bring meaning and transcendence to anything, but it takes a very intentional leader who decides that he or she wants to do that and then puts some thought behind it. And storytelling may not be the entire answer, but I think it's a big part of the answer. So I'm going to leave it at that. Any final thoughts you'd like to share, Dave?
I hope that maybe some of your listeners have checked out. Maybe transcendence and hope is too much for some of your leaders. I think some of your leaders are feeling something happen right now, and some of your listeners are saying that's what I'm looking for, and it's what you and I are talking about. And if some of your listeners are saying this is the conversation we need to be in, you and I both have some thoughts on how we can support that.
I would say I would 100% say, if there's even a part of you that says, hey, it would be kind of cool to bring a bit of hope, meaning, transcendence, reach out to David. We'll have all of your contact information in the show notes so that people can reach out to you. And at the very least, a great conversation about this can't hurt and possibly can help.
And you know what? If you're just selling tacos and widgets, I can help you with that too.
Yeah. In fact, I would say that's because some organizations, their product or service is like the meaning is so embedded into it. It's sort of a natural. I like the idea of taking your gritty products and services where it's not obvious, but suddenly you can create a real difference by building in a very compelling story into the business itself. I have to keep a promise that I made to my marketing team. It's been interesting as the podcast has has gotten more traction. I've gotten lots of consultants who have reached out to me, and one of them said, "Why don't you ever ask people to like your podcast? Why you never ask for likes? You never ask to hit the subscribe button?" And I said to him, it's weird because it feels like you're asking people to like you just goes against my grain. It goes against my grain. And and
We got to sell, brother. We got to sell.
yeah, and so someone finally said, "Look, asking people to like you, it's not the same as asking people to like you. You're not asking them to like you. You're asking them to just click the like button or click the subscribe button. Just and then he walked me through the metrics and how it makes a difference. So I would say, if this kind of conversation resonates with you, subscribe to the podcast. You'll get notified whenever we post a new one. Every Tuesday afternoon, a new one posts. And how could you not like David Hutchens? So hit the like button, and it'll help the algorithms promote us, however they do that. So, David, this is great. I appreciate your time. We'll talk again, I'm sure, many times, both on podcasts and off podcasts. We'll definitely stay connected. So thank you.
Anytime you like, I'll show up.